All right, and welcome. Today we are the East Bay Advisory Panel. Today it consists of Hunter Marckwardt, Hans Struzyna, myself, Mike Troxell, Jodi Phillips, and Jennifer Croshal. We'll be discussing what you should know about buying and selling in the San Francisco Bay Area housing market. Hans will lead us off to discuss lending and the mortgage process. We'll flow to Hans, who will discuss the purchasing process, searching and purchasing. Jodi Phillips, the attorney, will discuss how to take title and other legal implications of buying a house. And Jennifer will finish us off with discussing the tax implications. So Hans, feel free to take it away and maybe walk us through, from start to finish, high level, what the I want to buy a house. I call you. What does that entire process look like?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, so I get a lot of people who start reaching out to me, whether live, like at an open house, or they find my website and they're like, I want to buy a house. What do I do? And there's a number of answers to that question, but it always starts with like, have you talked with a lender? And we'll get to where that comes in just a second. But at a very high level, you really have to know your budget and your numbers. So I think probably having Hunter sort of tee us up, because when someone calls me or talks to me about buying a house, my first question is, have you gotten fully underwritten by a lender? If not, you're almost wasting your time talking to an agent or touring houses, because that is such a critical piece of this, knowing your budget, knowing your numbers. So I think that's actually probably the best place for people to start is dig in with a lender.
Absolutely. Thanks for bailing me out there. Yes. Hunter's going to lead us off.
Okay. Thanks, Mike and Hans. So yeah, I think, buying in the Bay Area, what people have to recognize is that buying in the Bay Area is very different than buying in other places around the country, just because the timelines are so tight, and a buyer needs to be thinking, what do they need to do to make themselves as attractive as possible to a seller and to a listing agent. That's really the mindset that you have to come in, because it's so competitive here. So there's basically three different stages when we're talking to a client, just so people understand the terminology. There's what's called a pre-qualification. A pre-qualification literally just means that I have a conversation with a client, we take a loan application, and you pull someone's credit report. And basically, like, if someone qualifies based on their debt to income ratios and their credit scores, their down payment, a bunch of different things, then we would consider them pre-qualified. That doesn't mean anything in this market. So the next phase is what's called the pre-approval. Pre-approval just means that we have that loan application, we've pulled the credit, and then we also have all of the documentation that supports that borrower's qualification. So things like W-2s and bank statements, pay stubs, all of that information gets reviewed, and then you're pre-approved. Pre-approval, what people have to understand, it's kind of the front end of the house. Like, most of the time, you don't actually deal with an underwriter until you go into contract. That's just generally, it's just something that happens literally once you go into contract. Then you typically, in a normal environment, would have 14 or 17 days of what are called loan and appraisal contingencies in order to actually get the loan done. In this market, what we see is that a lot of buyers actually can't have those contingencies if they want to get the offer accepted. So you need to be talking to lenders that will allow you to get through underwriting ahead of time, which is one of the things that we do. So what that means is that you're acting like you're in contract out of the gate, so that the actual underwriter who is going to sign off on this loan, instead of the loan team, is going to actually underwrite your loan ahead of time. So it basically minimizes the risk that buyers are being put in, because right now you have to, you'll come up with a 3% deposit out of the gates, and that deposit is at risk if the lender can't make the loan happen. So to be able to get you through underwriting ahead of time basically minimizes that risk. So if you think about it, there's pre-qualification, and quite frankly, it's not like, don't get pre-qualified. At a minimum, get pre-approved, and hopefully get fully underwritten. So does that help, Mike?
Absolutely, it does.
Okay.
And so I guess in the Bay Area, it's also a hot topic, the down payment process, right? There's a lot of folks that maybe their income's there, but they really are worried about that down payment. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is one more important than the other as far as income versus down payment?
Yeah, they're both important. I mean, you need to have it. It depends on the price point as well. There's what's called a jumbo mortgage. There's conforming loans, which are, you'll hear the name Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Those are loans in the Bay Area right now that are $822,000 and below. And when you're doing a government, a Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac conforming loan, you can put as little as 3% down. We try to get people to put at least 5% down. But when you go above that 822, you're going into the jumbo market, and jumbo loans are more specific. They want it, or they're more detailed. They want to see, typically, we can do 10% down, but typically when you're doing jumbo loans, the magic number is 20% down. So, what we try to get everybody to do, and, whether it be with us or someone else, is you have to, if you're a buyer, you have to take the time to say, and if you're me, you have to take the time to explain to buyers, really, there's four components. There's your credit. What does your credit look like? What is your kind of the asset bucket, which is what's your down payment look like? And then also, what are your reserves? If you're doing a jumbo loan, lenders will require that you have what's called a reserve, which is just your all-in monthly mortgage payment. So let's just say a lender says, well, we need 12 months of reserves, and your all-in number for principal, interest, taxes, and insurance is $5,000. Then they would say, you need to have $60,000 left after your down payment, after your closing costs are done, basically to help, in the lender's eyes, minimize the risk of if you lost your job or something like that, what would happen. So that's the second bucket. Then the third bucket is what's called the debt to income ratios. And we always tell people, debt to income ratios, what a lender will approve you for, even after the mortgage meltdown, is still not always what is in your best interest. So I think people have to be careful to just say, go out and get pre-approved, and some lender just tells you what your max pre-approval is, because that's basically the absolute ceiling of what they can approve you for. So you need to be careful with that, with the debt to income ratios. And then the final bucket is just what type of property are you buying? Is it a single family home? Is it a condo? Is it a townhouse, a duplex? Basically, those four quadrants then go in to determine what type of loan, what type of down payment is going to be required, what the interest rate is going to look like, based on all of that info.
That's great. And is there a time that's too early or too late to reach out to a lender?
Well, Hans will be the first one to tell you it's too late when you want to write an offer. People need to be proactive. We like to get our clients, we call it going through, I probably need to figure out a better way to say it, but like, we want to put you through as much pain as we can up front, so that the rest of the process is smooth sailing. Where people, I don't think there is a time where it's too early, because at the worst case scenario, you just need updated documents down the road. We've had clients that are pre-approved for 6 months, 9 months. And we just need a little bit of updated information if we're buying 6 to 9 months from now. But more than anything, like, you just want to have, even with the group of this, all the folks that are on this call right now, it's like, you need to have the right team to help you just kind of orchestrate what your plan is going to be. And if you can go through it up front, it's so much less stressful. Buying a home is obviously a huge deal, and it is incredibly stressful. But to go through this whole process up front, and just know that there's no surprises on what is the cash to close going to look like, right? If Hans is buying in Alameda versus Berkeley, there's transfer taxes and things like that. So you just need to make sure that you have your whole picture dialed in, and then the rest of the process is it's just a much better experience for buyers. So.
Yep, and it's a good segue. You mentioned the transfer taxes. So outside of just writing a check for that down payment, are there any other costs involved? I know sometimes people are surprised that there's extra cost for this or that. Is there a rule of thumb, like an amount or a percentage, or does it really just vary county by county?
It does vary by county, just on the actual transfer tax. I try to get people, it's not a one size fits all, because of what are called, like, some people want to have impounds for taxes and insurance, which means that's part of the mortgage payment on a monthly basis. if you want that, it's like, it's not an additional fee, but you'll have to pre-fund depending on what time of year you have to add 8 to 10 months of taxes at the closing table. But just in general, I would tell people that if you're thinking probably I would say 1.5% to 2% of the purchase price is what you would need to come in with additionally. So if you're buying a $1.5 million house in the Bay Area, I would expect to have to bring in $20,000 to $25,000 above and beyond the down payment, just as a general rule of thumb.
Gotcha. So with the impound, with maybe the transfer tax, and maybe with the reserves, sometimes the cash balance could be misleading, right? Where one could think I have $100,000 set aside for the down payment. Well, it might only be 80 or 90 or 95, depending on the type of loan and the county and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I would expect, yeah, like I said, I mean, it would be, I would say 1.5% to 2% is a good number to just use as a estimate above and beyond your down payment. And if you're doing jumbo, then you have to have those reserves as well. And sometimes the reserves, some lenders will look at it and allow you to take retirement. Other lenders won't allow you to look at retirement as a reserve. So there's just a lot of, I think where people have to be careful is there's just some general assumptions that, okay, I make $250,000 and I have $500,000 in the bank, I'll get approved for a loan. And then it's just, depending on how someone's compensated, bonus income, restricted stock units, which RSU income is a big thing in the Bay Area. Like, and when certain lenders look at those differently. So it's not always about what you're qualified for. It's about what a lender's underwriting guidelines are and how they're going to determine what you can and can't use. And it can be incredibly frustrating because a lot of it doesn't make sense, but it is what it is. So for people to have to, you don't want to make an assumption that you're fine. You have to go through the process.
And is all debt equal in the eyes of a lender for a debt to income ratio, as far as like student loans, auto loans, credit card debt? Or
basically whatever is showing up on your credit report is what we're going to need to utilize. So sometimes we'll have someone pay off debt, or we'll have someone, let's say someone has $1,000 a month car payment, but they only have, they have a year left, and it might be better off that they pay the car off as opposed to putting 22% down versus 20% down. So basically though, when you pull a credit report and there's a minimum payment on there, that's what they're factoring in.
Gotcha. Okay. So one does not look worse than the other per se.
Right.
All right. So before we go over so we're pre-approved and we're going to jump to Hans and say, hey, okay, I want to buy a house or look for houses. Hunter, is there anything else you want to add, and anything else that we missed that you think would be important for listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't want to oversell us on this call. For anybody, as Hans will tell you, you have to, like, not all lenders are created equal. And I think people have to be aware of, what I tell our buyers are, like, you need to believe that whoever your lender is, you need to believe that lender is going to have an impact on your offer getting accepted or not. And that's just kind of the bar that we hold ourselves to. Obviously there's plenty of people out there doing lending, but that's the mindset that you want your lender to have going into this. It's going to, whether or not someone can close in 21 days or 30 days is a huge difference. Underwriting versus not being underwritten ahead of time is a huge difference. Proactive communication with the seller, and you have to imagine that there's a listing agent and a seller sitting there in their kitchen and they're reviewing 10 different offers. What is it about your offer that looks differently so that it would get accepted? It's not always, we just had an offer get accepted that was $25,000 under the highest price because of our terms compared to the other lenders. So you just need to be super aware of what your lender is doing to help you get into contract. So I would just say, from a mindset perspective, you want to be thinking like that.
Wow, that's a pretty good nugget. I've never heard a scenario like that, so I'd love to learn more offline. All right, so I'm pre-approved. Do I just go to Zillow, or do I reach out to Hans? Hans, do you want to walk us through that the entire process there? And then I think Jennifer would have some questions for you after that.
Yeah. The online platforms are a great place to start to, like, really just high level figure out what you're looking for and where. but it's really deceptive. When you're looking at let's talk about listing price right now. People are saying, oh, I think I can afford $1 million house, but $1 million house doesn't show up as $1 million house online. And as the first thing I always have to educate folks on is it's a teaser pricing model here in the Bay Area. It simply means the price you see is absolutely not the price you pay. In fact, the number you see listed is actually really part of the marketing for that property. It's designed to get clicks and likes and shares, right? Like that's what I use whenever I list a property is I want eyeballs. I want people at the open house. And so when you divorce yourself from this idea of Zillow, the number on Zillow or Redfin is the number, it's not. It's probably something in the magnitude of 20 to 30% more than whatever that is, depending on the property, depending on the location, of course. But that's a really rough rule of thumb. But in general, this process, because there are so many not straightforward elements to it, it's really important to build a team for success. And kind of like what Hunter was talking about, whenever I talk to a new buyer, I'm always talking about you've got a 3-person or 3-entity team. You've got yourself as the buyer who's at the center of it. And then you've got your agent on the one side and you've got your lender on the other. And those choices are really, really critical because ultimately what you're trying to do is impress that seller to take your offer. Ideally, write an offer that their agent would have written themselves with the lender, the terms, et cetera, right? And so if you can get that listing agent's endorsement through the team you've picked, through the decisions you've made along the way, you've just moved yourself that much closer to actually making the house yours. But along that path, there's a couple of other things that are really, really important. We trade as is in real estate. And there's this term in real estate that gets thrown out as is a lot, but what it doesn't mean the same thing here in practice that it does in other parts of the country. And so one thing that's quite unique here in the Bay Area is sellers will spend thousands of dollars in most cases on inspection reports, on repairs, on a number of things before they go and put the property on the market, and expect that the buyer is going to spend their time doing the diligence on the information they've disclosed and presented, and then write them an offer subject to all of it. And the way that happens is by actually writing a non-contingent offer, meaning you remove your physical inspection contingency. And that really freaks a lot of people out. And so what I always tell folks is 2 things. Number 1, you always remove your contingencies in an offer to buy real estate. It's just a matter of when. We do it up front. And so that puts the front loaded work on the buyer to do the diligence before they write their offer, as opposed to during escrow, as an example. And so it's really critical when you're picking your team members, the agent in this particular case, that agent is well versed in what's typical and what's not typical in the city and the market you're buying, as well as who the known quantities of inspectors are. Not all inspectors are created equal. Some are cheaper and some are better, right? And so what's being disclosed, if you're expected to take it subject to, you want to know that you've gotten all the information. So vetting that out is really, really critical and a huge value add that your agent should be providing to you. The other side of this is, of course, the financing side and the other contingencies. Every contract has 3 major contingencies that most people talk about. Physical inspection we just talked about, but appraisal and loan contingencies as well. The loan contingency, simply put, is Hunter's world. If he says you're fully underwritten or you can qualify for this loan, assuming nothing changes on your file, then you've got that confidence that you can potentially remove it. If you don't have that word of confidence from your lender, you cannot responsibly remove that loan contingency, which puts you at a deficit in competition. And then the third part of this is the appraisal. So once you get into a contract, Hunter is going to order this appraisal from this third-party pool of appraisers. Someone is going to come out for a fee, measure the house, take photos of the smoke detectors and the water heater and all these different pieces of it, and then look at comparables and come up with a value to hopefully support your purchase price. And then that depends, and then your agent is really it's really important that your agent understands the neighborhood and the comps. And if you go to that side of the street, you lose 20% of value, and this side of and up the hill is got better views, and so those are more expensive, etc. But it's also really important that your appraiser knows that. And this is one thing Hunter didn't talk about, which I always encourage people to ask when they're interviewing lenders, is where does your pool of appraisers come from? Because if you have a pool of appraisers who are coming from the Central Valley to appraise in, say, Berkeley, they may have never been to Berkeley before. They sure as heck don't know which side of the street is better or worse. And so you're going to get, you're kind of rolling the dice on whether or not the appraisal is going to come in at value, as opposed to having a professional pool who lives within 10 miles of the property and has been appraising for 10 or more years in that city. Like, you can feel pretty confident that they're going to understand how to interpret the comps like your agent and like you are, and like your competition is, most importantly, right? So ultimately what's trying to happen is you're putting yourself in a position to write a non-contingent offer and do so responsibly, underscore, highlight, bold, italicize, responsibly, and then put that in front of the seller on a competitive offer day, meaning in our market, we set offer dates. So a week, 2 weeks after the property's gone on the market, they're going to collect all the bids on one specific day at a specific time and review them together. And that is going to be your moment to impress them, or you're going to lose them in that moment. And so that's where all of this work kind of comes down to, in sometimes an hour or an afternoon. And that's what you're really teeing yourself up for, is performance in that one moment.
Great, Hans. That's really, really helpful. You covered a lot of information there. I think that, you know, some of the main questions we discussed to ask you before, you actually touched on. And, you know, I'm just going to kind of ask you to go a little bit more in depth in a couple of areas. And one
Sure.
of them being, you mentioned disclosures. You know, what disclosures are sellers actually giving? You know, are they covering all the big areas so that a buyer can actually go in and feel confident to remove that contingency?
Yeah. Every house is different. And that's one thing that's really unique about value and about inspections is we don't have a lot of tract homes. We don't have a lot of subdivision communities that sprawl like you do in the Sacramento or the Central Valley. And so you're really talking about like custom unique homes that have been added to and upgraded and stuff. But in general, what you're going to see in every disclosure packet that you receive is a general home inspection and a pest inspection, which is actually a wood destroying organisms inspection. So they're looking for dry rot, fungus, mold, termites, wood-boring beetles, etc. From those two inspections, there may be call outs to get supplemental or extra inspections, roofs, chimneys, foundations, soil reports, test hole reports, etc. And those will be buried in the fine print, so to say, of the reports. And so it's really critical to go through those and make sure that they got them. And if they did, who did the report, who did the actual supplemental as well as the original report. On top of all of that, you'll always see two documents that the seller produces. One is called the real estate transfer disclosure statement. The other is the seller property questionnaire. In short, those are 7 pages of yes, no questions of almost anything a seller should know about a property and is obligated to disclose to you in their own words. And that is a form that the seller fills out themselves, unless they're exempt through a trust and their trustees and their kids and they've never lived there, in which case you really have to focus on the reports. But those 4 things exist, and those are the 4 that I always recommend people start with to see if there's any huge red flags that that would totally turn them off to the property. And if they get through all of that and they don't see anything that's killing the deal for them, then you're going to see things like a natural hazard report, a title report, a color-coded map if there are easements or some such thing. You're also going to need to look at the sewer lateral or the other point of sale ordinances. Every city in the East Bay has different things that they're going to require you to do once the property is transferred. Alameda has a gas shutoff valve as an example. Oakland has a sidewalk ordinance. Berkeley and Piedmont now have basically an energy efficiency audit that needs to be done and filed prior to close of escrow. So there's a number of things that are specific to the cities as well. And then we touched on it a few minutes ago, but I just wanted to plug this. Every city has a different transfer tax amount, which is the city transfer tax and a county tax. And those ones are pretty significant. And Berkeley and Oakland in particular, this is relatively new, have a graduated basis. So as you reach certain price points, you start to pay more and more as a percentage as well. So you really want to make sure you're doing your diligence there. One last thing inspection wise that you really need to pay attention to, most people don't think about this, but your inspection contingency is very broad and includes things like the Megan's Law database and the insurability of the property. With insurance these days, with fire risk, with fault zones, with flood risks in certain parts of the bay, the lender might require you to hold certain types of insurance, and that might be hellishly expensive. Or you may want for your personal sense of well-being to get that. And if you can only get a $7,000 supplemental policy for whatever it is a year, that's going to drastically impact your debt to income ratios and just your general finances. So you really need to do that upfront as well to make sure that you can get insurance and that it's not ridiculously expensive.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think that kind of leads us into my next question, which is, how does a buyer make themselves more appealing? You know, they can have the financial side set up, they can have the insurance side set up. What are other things from an agent's perspective that make a buyer really look good to the seller?
So what happens is, to some degree, your offer ends up on some kind of a spreadsheet most of the time. Sometimes it's even a net sheet where the seller will estimate all the closing costs and then look at a bottom line net. But either way, you're going to end up kind of into a number of columns or rows, if you will. And so certain things like the name of the agent, the name of the lender, those are really big things that can stand out. Because if you have a big bank and then you have Hunter, most top listing agents know Hunter. And so that is going to stand out pretty significantly. Down payment amounts are another really big one. Because we trade as is, and the idea is to responsibly remove all your contingencies. If you're sitting right at 20% down and everybody knows that you're pushing the price on a dollar per square foot basis because it's competitive and you have to, and you're competing against someone who's say 30 or 40% down, whether they intend on going to that down payment or not is sort of irrelevant, but they could. And so to the seller, if there's a appraisal shortfall, if the appraised value comes in below the purchase price, there's cash there to keep the deal going. But if you're just coming in at 20% and you need to hold all the rest in the reserves, and the deal might fall apart over a $30,000, $50,000 low appraisal, they're probably going to lean into the bigger cash down payment. And so that's another big one, that if you have the ability to show a big down payment and you can figure out how to make that happen with the lender and with your finances, that is a big feather in your cap when it comes to showing up on the offer day and looking attractive. And one last thing, because this always comes up when I bring this up, is like, well, what about cash? What about people who bring in all cash? Isn't that the most attractive? And yes, it is. But if you are in the realm, if you have a good lender, if you have a strong, solid down payment and a non-contingent offer, a cash offer is worth about $10,000 to maybe $20,000. So if your price is above that cash offer and you've got a strong lender like Hunter, a great agent, and a really like a 25% down payment, let's say, like you were now basically the same as cash, because who wouldn't wait another 5 or 10 days to close and get $5,000 or $10,000 or $20,000 more?
Good to hear. So, from that point of view, and given the pandemic situation and how people have been moving out of cities to get larger spaces. You know, do you think that this market is too hot? You know, are we looking at it staying like this? Obviously, no one has, you know, that future, no one can tell the future, but, you know, just what do you think of this in your experience now? You've been doing this for a long time. How do you see this going?
It's, I mean, certainly it's anyone's guess what the future will hold. I think
I hate to put you on the spot there.
I think interest rates, and Hunter can probably speak to this more intelligently than I can, but interest rates will have an impact at a certain point. Like a couple of years ago when we were knocking on the door of 5% interest rates, people were still transacting, not at the same high price points that they were. There were maybe a few less offers, but in the Bay Area, I mean, barring some gigantic catastrophe economically or, you know, like a natural disaster, people want to be here. People are still moving here. There's still a lot of opportunity and jobs, although obviously many of them are tech-based and, you know, high paying, and that's a different conversation. But in general, it still feels like people want to be here and value what the Bay Area has to offer. And I'll finish with, I think I've never had anyone buy a single family home that they intend to live in and raise a family in or make memories in and had the finances, or I'm sorry, the ROI be the driver of that purchasing decision.
Mm-hmm.
People buy homes to live in them and enjoy them. And of course they want to like justify the price they're paying. But sometimes people value the memories and the life and the family aspect, right? And I think that that's what we're seeing right now is sort of this collision of like a lot of people have a lot of cash and stock options and cryptocurrency with I am done living in the city in a $4,000 a month, 800 square foot shoebox, right? Yeah. I want a yard and I want to raise a family somewhere and I want to have like a neighborhood, right? And so if that changes, I think then maybe everything will change locally. I mean, nationally, who the heck knows? That's a big country, right? But
yeah.
that's kind of how it feels right now to me, at least in the transactions I'm involved in.
Okay. And that leads us to, you know, once you have found a place that you want to buy and you're going to buy it, what do you do from a legal perspective? I think Jodi's going to take us there, and I'm going to share my screen for a slide for her. You'll give me just one moment. All right, take us away.
All right. So my name is Jodi Phillips. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Vaughn Buttress in Oakland, California. And I've been doing estate planning and probate and trust administration and litigation for 7 years. So this is an area that I have focused on solely for my entire legal career, and I'm very passionate about this area of law. So what to do once you've gotten through all of the processes that Hunter and Hans have talked about and you finally own a home. One of the things that comes up at closing is, how are you going to take title to your new home? If you're married, you have a couple of options. The most popular one in California is community property. California is a community property state. And what that means is everything that you earn or acquire during your marriage is deemed to be community property, unless, of course, you have a prenup or a postnuptial agreement. Another option is joint tenancy. And this is a type of way that you can take title with someone if you're married or if you're not married. And the benefit of joint tenancy is the surviving joint tenant, if one of you passes away, automatically becomes the sole owner of that joint tenancy. With community property, similarly, the surviving spouse usually can get the remaining half of that property, but spouses in California can actually gift their half of the community property away to somebody else. Joint tenancy, if you do something like that, you actually sever the joint tenancy, and that joint tenancy actually then becomes tenancy in common, which is another way to hold title, meaning that you own a certain percentage of that property outright, and that you can then leave that interest of property to any individual, whether it's a spouse, sibling, or a child. If you are not married in California and you want to take title, the two options that you have are joint tenancy or tenancy in common. Similarly, if there are multiple owners, so if your parents maybe are helping out with your down payment, because as Hans and Hunter talked about, having them bigger down payment obviously makes your offer much more desirable. Having a parent or some other relative possibly assisting with your down payment may mean that you are, having them as co-signers possibly for your loan, or if they're gifting property cash to you for your down payment, maybe you make a deal with that individual to be a co-signer and actually own the property with you. So again, you could take title as joint tenancy, or if it's between you and a parent and your spouse, you and your spouse could be on title as community property, but you would be joint tenants with that other individual, whether it's a parent or a sibling. Another thing that's a benefit with taking title as community property is, and this is something that's not necessarily the fun, happy thing to think about, is when you own property as community property, on the first spouse's death, you actually get a step up in basis. And this is to help avoid any potential capital gains taxes at the time that you eventually sell the property, if you do sell the property. So that's another sort of benefit between joint tenancy versus community property that you have as options if you are in fact married. Now, another option that people often say is, well, once I've bought a house, shouldn't I put it into a trust? And I always say, yes, it's really good to have a trust if you either own real property in California or if you have minor children, or both. The benefit of a trust is that you can actually get around the default rules in California if you pass away, and you can designate specifically how you want your assets to be divided upon your passing or your incapacity. And so a trust is essentially, what I like to explain to clients is, it's like a shoebox where you put all of your major assets into that shoebox. You have a set of instructions, and you, at your death or at your incapacity, hand that shoebox with those instructions to your designated successor trustee. And that successor trustee will actually then follow the instructions in the trust and give out the assets in that shoebox to your intended beneficiaries at the designated time that they're supposed to receive it. A will is similar in that you can designate who is supposed to get your assets, but it actually has to go through the probate court system in the county in which you died. And a will, yes, it's really good, but it's a bit of a band-aid to doing your estate plan. And if you do have minor children and you pass away while they're still minors, those assets would be held in sort of a guardianship of the children's estate until they turn 18. And then once they turn 18, they would be entitled to whatever assets that you left them. And as we all know, as we get older, we tend to make better financial decisions. So typically when I have clients who have young kids, I always recommend delaying when your children are supposed to get their inheritance, because you make better decisions with, that maybe $500,000 of inheritance at the age of 35 than you would at 20. And it's amazing how quickly kids can go through a lot of sums of cash. And so it's always better having it in trust for their benefit, that they can tap into it if it's needed, but it will be sort of safeguarded for them over that period of time. So that way they don't blow through all of their inheritance. And when taking title, if you already have a trust set up, it's still really important that you actually still take title as either community property, joint tenancy, or tenancy in common first, and then transfer it to your trust. The reason being is that if you ever have to take it out of that trust for some reason, such as a refinance, you need to know how you originally took title and how it was vested. And that's a really important issue for legality purposes. And so sometimes individuals, when they're closing an escrow, don't necessarily think about those things. But it's always a really important thing that you want to take title first as individuals, as either a married couple, whether it's community property or joint tenancy, and then follow up if you already have a trust, to then put it into your trust with a trust transfer deed. Or if you don't already have a trust, once you purchase that property, then work with an attorney to actually create your trust and get your property put into the trust. One thing that's important is also that your property taxes are not going to be reassessed simply by putting it into a trust. Your property taxes will stay the same based on when you took title, but and that's done with another form that gets sent to the county assessor when you record your new deed with the county recorder. But that is something that is really something that your attorney can help you with. And another reason why having your house put into a trust is that it actually avoids any potential reimbursement from Medi-Cal, which is insurance for health insurance if you are below a certain income threshold. And oftentimes in California, it used to be that if you passed away and you received Medi-Cal at any point during your lifetime, Medi-Cal could then make a claim against your estate. But if you actually have all of your assets in trust, Medi-Cal no longer seeks reimbursement. So that's something also that's really important to think about. And I know I touched on briefly about incapacity, that you know, young, healthy people don't tend to think about incapacity, but as a planner, I always am worried about that, because if for some reason something happened to you, if you were in a car accident or you got an illness such as COVID and ended up in a coma or some other issue, a health issue where you were no longer able to legally make decisions because of mental incapacity or due to a health issue where you were not able to communicate and advocate for yourself, having these type of estate plan documents, such as a power of attorney and a healthcare directive, as well as a trust, protects your assets for you for the benefit during your lifetime. And then it also then protects your either your spouse or your children when the time comes. So that's you know, a really brief overview. I know that was a lot of information. I know that there's probably a lot of people out there thinking, well, I can just go on LegalZoom and do this myself. Yes, it's an option. Yes, it's less expensive, but as I mentioned earlier, I do litigation, and that is one of the things that I often see end up in litigation or end up in court, is because the documents aren't necessarily done properly. There might be an issue with the execution of how those documents were done. And so if you want to get it done right and, you know, avoid cleaning up expensive mistakes in the long run, I do always recommend working with an attorney. And, you know, there's a gamut of types of attorneys out there. So just do your research and always ask around for a recommendation. And I'm going to hand it back to Jennifer, who's going to talk about some of the tax implications about homeownership.
Great, thank you, Jodi. And I will vouch for seeing on the latter end when it's been written incorrectly and there's a tax implication of that and someone was surprised by it. So very good advice there. So I'm Jennifer Croshal. I'm a CPA here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we're a full service CPA firm. We focus on individuals, businesses, estates, and trusts. So we are seeing a lot of people coming to us for planning related to buying or selling their home, especially within the last couple of years. So, you know, today I just kind of wanted to talk to you about like the big benefits and limitations and a couple of areas that you should consider speaking with a professional about, because doing the planning ahead of time with your team, all of us, really is kind of a big deal in this area, especially. So some of the benefits, and I've listed here, you know, some of the benefits. You might be familiar with the term standard deduction, itemized deduction. Everybody is given that standard deduction amount. The IRS determines that you will qualify for these amounts based on your filing status. And if you go above those amounts, you will itemize your deductions. And there are different categories of deductions that you can take, one of which being the mortgage interest and the property taxes. So when you're purchasing or selling a home, you want to do projections and know how that is going to affect your tax situation. So some of the limitations do fall into these categories, because after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act law was passed in December of 2017, mortgage interest, home equity lines, mortgage insurance premiums, they were limited in a way they hadn't been before. So you can deduct up to $750,000 of acquisition debt in this category of mortgage interest on your personal taxes. And anything above that cannot be deducted. So if you're purchasing a home, you're going to finance a large portion of that. You want to know how much you're actually getting a benefit for, especially here in the Bay Area where housing prices are well above $750,000 in a lot of cases. So that's just something to consider in terms of limitations there. And then property tax deductions. A lot of people come and they say, oh, my property tax bill is going to be huge, but I can deduct it on my taxes. And the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act also limited your state and local tax deductions. And that's one of the categories of itemized deductions. So when you're doing a calculation of what the tax benefit is going to be for purchasing or what you're going to lose in terms of a benefit when you sell, you want to know that you are limited in that category to only $10,000. And that includes your state income taxes, your property taxes, your DMV fees, your sales taxes, and those are all limited in this one category to that 10,000. I also wanted to talk to you about just some other implications, some other considerations from a tax perspective to talk to about with a CPA, and investment properties. You know, a lot of people are talking about buying a personal property because they want more space or they want a backyard, like Hans was saying. But in addition to that, people are talking about buying investment properties, whether it's in California or out of state. And you really want to know what the difference is between buying a principal residence where you and your family will live and buying an investment property. So where will that be reported on your tax return? Is it going to be purchased in an entity? Do you need to file another type of tax return? What are your deductions that are going to be included and which ones aren't? So I would bring this up just to make sure that you know to talk to a professional when doing this planning before you purchase the property so that you know what you're actually working with. And then the last big consideration I wanted to bring up was gifting from a third party. And so it was kind of touched on a little bit in terms of financing and where you're going to get the actual money to put down. But if your parents are going to give you money, or a friend, or you know, you're getting money from a third party that's going to be gifted to you, you need to know what the implications of that are going to be. And there's two big things that you need to know. There are annual limits to how much you can be gifted without questions asked. And there are lifetime limits that someone can gift you money. And there are tax implications to both. So if you are given more than $15,000, then the gifter needs to file a tax return to let the IRS know that they gave you this money. There's no tax related to it, but they need to file this reporting return. And so that's a very important requirement for the person that is gifting. The lifetime limit is where all of those annual gifting amounts are going to be tracked with the IRS. And if you go over this limit, right now under current law, it's $11.18 million that's exempt. If you go above that, then there are other tax implications that you want to be aware of. So I just wanted to bring that up because it is very important as a CPA for me to be able to plan with my clients on these different topics, because beforehand I can help, after I may not be able to help. So those are the big areas I wanted to touch on. I think that we covered a lot of information, but I'm happy to talk to you after if you want to contact me for more specifics on any of these topics.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And so we can do a quick round the horn if anyone has some additional questions for one of the speakers. I'm happy to go first. I have a few. Maybe we'll start with Hunter. Hunter, I guess, Jennifer, you just spoke about gifting, right? So Hunter, how do gifts come into play with the lending process? I've heard some situations where the family had to write a letter and sign off and say this is a gift, it's not a loan. Is that the case? And anything else to add around gifting?
Yeah, you have to, when you are gifting, you have to call it a gift, right? There's a difference. Money that is lenders are going to look at 2 months of bank statements. So a gift is something that doesn't need to be seasoned. That money can be used immediately if it's a gift and it requires a gift letter saying that you do not expect to pay this gift back. That's some families, I mean, it's not right, by the way. So I'll preface that right now. Some family members want to gift, but get the money back, which obviously is not a gift, that is a loan. And if that's the case, a lender would look at that and say, let's just say it's $1 million purchase price and the family member is giving them $200,000 and it's not a gift. The lender looks at that as 100% financing, even though the lender's only lending 80%. So you have to call it a gift is usable. It's absolutely fine. You just need a gift letter and you can't be expecting to repay. Anything other than that would be considered a loan from the family member, which can't be used.
And you mentioned bank statements, right? So if you're looking at a bank statement and you see some $50,000 inflow, then you're going to ask, hey, what is this?
What
Where'd
is
it come
that?
from?
Exactly. Yeah, you have to, so any deposits that are typically more than $2,000 have to be sourced with a letter of explanation. So it's annoying, but it happens. You have to do it. So.
Yeah. All right, two more questions for you, Hunter. You mentioned with jumbo loans, the lenders sometimes will require a reserve, right? Where you have X amount of months of payment in your bank account after the down payment, right? And I've heard of 12 months before. You mentioned 12 months. Is that the standard? Is there a range?
It depends on the loan amounts. So if it's typically, and these are all in general, there's some niche products out there that it's not applicable, but basically under $1 million, you can expect 6 months. Between $1 million to $1.5 million, I would expect 12 months, and then $1.5 million and beyond up to 18 months. So that's, again, just a general rule of thumb.
Gotcha. Okay. And last one for you. You mentioned different lenders view RSU income differently in the Bay Area. A lot of people that work at public companies, especially a good chunk of their compensation comes in the form of stock. Any guidance there? Any rules of thumb there?
I would just say that there are lenders out there that simply won't use it. Like you have to have a 3-year history of receiving it, and you have to have a 3-year forward payout from them. So if there are some lenders that just look at it and say it's too complicated for us to calculate the type of RSU income that we're going to try to utilize for someone, so they just back it out and they say, they're just not interested in buying those loans. So I would just say this: if someone's telling you that you can't use RSU income, there are other options available for you. So you just got to make sure you don't go talk to the one lender that says, sorry, we can't use RSU income, and therefore you don't think you can buy a house. It's just not the case.
Yep. Okay, diving in a little deeper there, because standard, usually you get these over a 4-year period, and maybe you're not going to be at the company forever. So is it company specific? So say I'm at Microsoft for 3 years, I have my 3-year history, but I just left and I go to Google. Do they not count, or is that really situation by situation?
No, you're exactly right. You can't use that. You can't use the RSU income at Google or Microsoft for that matter, right? Because you're not going to be receiving it anymore, and the Google one isn't established yet. So yeah, exactly.
Gotcha. Interesting. So you have to be there for a while, and you have to be a good enough employee to have vests.
Yeah, and I think, Mike, to your point overall, it's just, if you're going to buy a house, if buying a house is your priority, then you do need to confirm. I mean, like, bonus income can't be used on the new job. Commission income can't be used on the new job. So you really do want to make sure you understand what you're doing before you go leave your job if you were trying to buy a house.
Yep, that's great information. And Hans, a question we asked Hunter earlier, but did not ask you: when should we reach out to you or an agent? Is there a time too early, too late?
I don't think there's a time too early. I think doing the scramble drill in a 48-hour period is a little too late, especially in our as-is market. But I always encourage people to start interviewing and start to have these conversations, ideally a couple months ahead of when they're actually going to buy and pull the trigger. Also because it's an iterative process, and you hear a lot of horror stories about people writing 10 or 12 offers. It's important to know who you're jumping in with. And I think you can only do that with some time, some interviewing, and some perspective. Like my average client writes 2.9 offers, I think, is what I'm tracking at for this year. And I know that's not the track record that everybody else has, but it's because I put in a lot of work with people ahead of time, reviewing disclosures, looking at comps, touring neighborhoods, etc. And it really pays off in the net result in the end. And so if you're just going with whomever you find online, or you get a referral to at the last minute, you're probably actually teeing yourself up for a much worse experience in the end. So the broad answer is start that conversation early, and do yourself a favor and talk to at least 2 agents, because I think the National Association of Realtors suggests that it's like 80 something percent of people talk to less than one agent or whatever the number is. And especially buying or selling at these price points, there's so much money on the line. We all get second opinions and third opinions about our health, about our finances, about all this stuff. And we're talking about hundreds of dollars swing in performance, one person to the next. So I think it's really critical to start that early and have those conversations ahead of time.
I do just have to plug Hans if I can real quick too, because I do think like people don't understand, to Hans's point, like that's the tricky thing about our business is it's so, oh, talk to my family friend, like you need to look at people's track records on how many buyers they have in fact helped. Like if you look at Hans and his entire team, I don't know that you're number one in Oakland right now. I mean, they're
in Oakland, we're
producers.
number one. Yeah.
They're huge producers and they're also wonderful people. And you have to look at people's track record. I mean, I would be asking everybody, like, how many homes have you helped people buy? And if they can't give you that information, it should not be a good sign. So,
yeah. And I do have a YouTube channel where I put out weekly videos. I just did one of like 5 questions you got to ask your realtor before you hire them. I think that was 3 weeks ago. And so I put out a lot of stuff like that. So if people want to just get my download of best practices, go check me out on YouTube. I've got a ton of content up there.
Yeah, that's great. And Hunter,
one question before we finish. And this is sort of to both of you, Hans and Hunter. How fast are things closing? I know the answer is probably it depends, but right now, just with all of the factors of, shortages and appraisers and just all of these things going on, what is the closing that somebody can expect? Are they looking at a long rent back or those kind of things?
Rent backs are sort of a separate component. But as far as closing is concerned, I've seen most of the stuff that I'm either on the list side or the buy side in about 25-ish days, plus or minus a little bit. Sometimes people are saying 21 days, which I've been calling a little bit of BS on folks because there's been such an appraisal shortage, as you've mentioned, and it sometimes takes in excess of 2 weeks to get someone to even come to the house and do the appraisal, plus 3 or 4 days to turn it back and send it to underwriting. And now you're at 21 days before you've gotten to final review. And Hunter can speak to that. But, I think that's alleviated just a little bit, but I'm seeing a lot of contracts for about 25 days, maybe at the top end 30. Hunter, is that something you're seeing too?
yeah, everything. And it does depend on jumbo versus conforming. And sometimes you get what are called appraisal waivers where you don't need an appraisal. So I would say, on the fastest level, it's 18 days to 25 days. And if we're trying to do something for 21 days, I always tell both parties we might be begging for forgiveness to Hans's point, depending on the appraisal.
And most people are aware, at least the listing agents that do the bulk of the business, because it's an 80-20 rule in our industry. It's so fast. I mean, I think it's with anything, but most people get it. But that's another part of hiring an agent is their reputation and their communication skills. If you're just consistently communicating with the other side, in this case, the listing agent, and saying, hey, the appraisal came in. I just got a text this morning from a guy who wrote an offer on a condo I was listing. He's like, hey, the appraisal is ordered for this week. I said, what day? He's like, hold on. Got back to me 5 minutes later. He's like, tomorrow, Tuesday, I'll be there. I'll take care of it. It's all done. And that level of communication, just like that simple exchange, makes everybody so much happier, because you're really managing like a very stressful moment for a seller and a buyer. And I think that ability to communicate and manage multiple balls in the air and understand the complexities and then simplify it to the people who need to hear the information is really critical to making a smooth, positive experience for everybody. And if you do something other than that, people freak out.
Yep. And Jodi, one question for you, or maybe one to highlight something, just to ensure I heard you correctly. So if you were, did your homework and you have your trust in place and you're buying a house, it still makes sense to buy it as individuals or as community property, depending on your situation, and then transfer in the trust. Did I hear that right?
Correct. So the reason being is that there's a number of situations that could come up down the line. one easy example is divorce. If the spouses were to divorce, you don't know how they took title originally if they take it straight as trustees of their trust. And the default in California is that you take property as husband and wife as community property, but it makes, in the event of a divorce, it makes it a lot cleaner to say, okay, no, we originally took title in this format. This is how it should go back to. And the reason that taking title as community property versus joint tenants for married couples is really important is because in the event the first spouse dies, with community property, you get a full step up in basis on those deaths. And so, but you only get a 50% step up in basis if you hold title as joint tenants. And so it has eventual tax implications on the gain that you get from the day you buy the house versus the date of value on that date of death. And so if you only get a 50% step up in that basis versus a full 100%, it has huge implications down the line that this could be, 40 years down the line, it could come up. And so that's why it's really important to, think this through. And a lot of times when people are going to, close and sign on the dotted line and ask us, how do you want to take title? Sometimes they're just like, I don't know. And so that's the reason it's really important to kind of consider what the implications are. And not all realtors will inform their clients because not all realtors know. And so it's really important, like we've said all day, is having a team of professionals that understand this and understand what the implications are. And, just being able to make the best educated decision that you can. And so, you don't want to just say, oh, yeah, well, we'll just put it into our trust directly. Well, no, that's not the best idea because you need to know how you actually vested title from the get-go, then immediately. And it can all be done simultaneously. But you have to sign that first deed as community property or as joint tenants or as tenants in common. And then you do another deed. It's simply another recording of a document. And because it would most likely be your primary residence, you're not going to be subject to the additional $75 recording fee that's assessed in all other recording documents. So it's maybe another $25 to $45. It's worth it to just take that extra step. Yes, sometimes these things seem redundant, but it has major consequences. And, trying to shortcut it, it could cost you thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in the end. I mean, that's really the, consequences
end up
of those
saving by
decisions.
just paying that little bit to get the right answer.
Exactly. And doing it right from the very beginning. And, a lot of times people talk about, well, oh, can I just do it this myself? Well, yes, but are you a lawyer? I mean, I specialized in this. I did an extra year in law school after I graduated with my law degree, specifically focusing on estate planning and trusts and wills, because this is such a specialized area. And, it's such an important area that affects everybody at some point in their lives. So always best to do it right the first time.
That's great. And we appreciate that. Unless there's any final questions, I think we can probably wrap up. I think we're coming up on an hour here, and that was pretty thorough and it was great.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw out, Jodi, what you were mentioning, like a lot of agents don't know the difference. And they don't. And even if they do, like my answer to people when they ask me that question is call your lawyer, call your CPA. Like, what's the implication? Because I'm trying to stay in my lane with my license and my fiduciary to my client, but I also know where that ends. And so whether they know or they don't know, I shouldn't be giving legal advice, and, I need to stay where I need to stay. So I think it's critically important to build this team around you. So just like what we've done on this call to get the right answers, because there's a lot of facets to all of this: taxes, legal, contract writing and negotiating, lending, all of those pieces. And if you can really build that team around you, you can really tee yourself up for huge success with all of this, or, complete failure if you want to do it yourself and, fly by the seat of your pants.
Yep, I couldn't agree more.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Well done. I think everyone who listens to this will find it very informative, and we'll see if we can do some fancy video editing and put some contact information at the end of this.
Cool.
Right
Thank
on.
you.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Have